Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. This time, we're going to try and unpack the really fascinating stuff surrounding the 2020 election, and of course, the January 6th attack on the Capitol, all through the lens of Special Counsel Jack Smith's final report.
Yep. See?
It's crazy because it's not just a regular legal case, right? We're talking about a former president who was indicted, then get this, gets reelected, and then the whole thing gets dismissed
Right.
because the DOJ has this policy about indicting a sitting president. It's
But-
a wild story.
Yeah.
And we're going to try and help you navigate all of it, pull out those little interesting bits,
Mhm.
the specifics that maybe you missed with everything else going on. So the report itself, it's structured around efforts to interfere with, the whole peaceful transfer of power thing. And it goes deep, really details the investigation, the charges they brought against Trump, and even some they thought about but didn't go for.
It's interesting, I think, from a historical perspective. You know, this report really shows how this whole thing went down. The anatomy of trying to overturn a democratic election. It's way beyond just legal stuff. It gets into those big questions about how our democracy actually works, what the limits are on presidential power, and even what our responsibilities are as citizens. Heavy stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's break down that main allegation, right? The report says Trump knew he lost, knew there wasn't any fraud that would change anything, but he still tried really hard to hang on to power.
Yeah, and the evidence that Smith's team got is pretty strong. The report points to a lot of times when Trump was told directly by people he worked with that this whole fraud thing was BS. But he kept saying it publicly anyway, feeding this whole narrative that the election was stolen.
It's kind of crazy, right? So for someone like you who's really into election integrity, this next part might be right up your alley. The report gives some specific examples of how they tried to overturn the election. That phone call, remember? The one Trump made to Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State. He asked him to find 11,780 votes.
Oh, yeah.
He thought votes were just magic beans or something.
Right, he could just pull them out of a hat. And that call, it wasn't just, a casual chat. It was part of this bigger organized thing to, pressure officials in states into changing results. The report talks about similar stuff at other states, so it felt like this coordinated campaign to mess with the whole election process.
Yeah, it wasn't just phone calls either. The report also talks about this whole scheme with fraudulent elector certificates. Basically, Trump's people, they created these fake groups of electors in some states that Biden won. They even went through the motions of meeting and voting for Trump, trying to copy the real thing, hoping to cause enough chaos to, stop the election from being certified.
Yeah, it was a bold move for sure. Can you imagine trying to convince Congress to go with these fake electors over the real ones? It could have thrown the whole election into total chaos. Thankfully, it didn't work.
Right.
But it makes you think about, how fragile democracy can be if people are willing to break the rules and mess with the system to get what they want.
For sure. And then there was all that pressure on Vice President Pence, which was a whole other level of trying to overturn the election. The report talks about how Trump kept trying to get Pence to, just reject electoral votes and declare him the winner during that whole certification thing.
Right.
Can you imagine being Pence? Your own boss, the president, is demanding you do something that could violate the Constitution and potentially start a full-blown constitutional crisis. That's got to be a level of pressure most people can't even fathom.
Yeah, it was intense, for sure. No doubt.
It's no wonder everyone was glued to their TVs during that whole certification thing. It was like watching a real-life thriller unfold. But let's move on to the actual charges they brought against Trump based on all this evidence. The report outlines 4 main charges, each with some pretty big consequences. The first one is conspiracy to defraud the United States. Basically, it alleges that Trump and his allies, they intentionally tried to obstruct a legitimate government function, in this case, the peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah, this charge goes right to the heart of the alleged scheme. It's not just about disagreeing with the election results. It's about actively trying to undermine the whole process of how we choose our leaders. If they had successfully prosecuted this charge, it could have been huge, potentially barring Trump from holding public office again and really setting a precedent against this kind of thing happening again in the future.
Yeah, big consequences.
Absolutely.
Then you have the conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding charge, which is specifically about the attempt to disrupt the electoral vote certification by Congress on January 6th.
Right. This charge really focuses on the events leading up to and during that whole crazy day. It alleges that Trump and his allies, they were working together, coordinating their efforts to pressure Pence, spreading all that misinformation about the election, and ultimately inciting the mob that stormed the Capitol.
Mm.
If they had proven this charge, it could have meant serious prison time for some people, and it would have really solidified the legal consequences of trying to obstruct a core democratic process. And then you've got obstruction of an official proceeding, which is kind of similar, but it focuses more on what Trump himself did to, get in the way of that January 6th certification.
Okay, so, like, while the conspiracy charge is about the group effort, this one's more about Trump's direct actions to try and stop the certification from actually happening.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's about those specific things he did. Like that speech he gave to his supporters on January 6th, where he told them to march to the Capitol and fight like hell to overturn the election. The report argues that those actions, along with everything else he'd been doing to pressure Pence and spread that election misinformation, well, it all directly contributed to the violence and chaos that happened that day.
Yeah, that speech was something else. I remember watching it live and just feeling this, like, sense of dread, like something bad was about to happen.
Yeah, it was a tense moment for sure.
And then the final charge, conspiracy against the right to vote and have one's vote counted. That one really hits at the core of our democracy, doesn't it? It's about protecting every citizen's right to, participate in the election and have their voice heard.
Right. This charge is important because it shifts the focus from the people in power to the everyday citizens. It alleges that Trump and his allies, they conspired to disenfranchise voters by spreading misinformation, casting doubt on the election, and trying to overturn the results. The report argues that these actions really undermine people's faith in our democracy and threaten the whole system of government.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that if these charges had gone to trial and, resulted in convictions, it could have totally changed our understanding of presidential power and accountability.
Oh, absolutely. These charges weren't just about punishing past actions. They were about setting a precedent for the future, drawing a line and saying that no one, not even the president, is above the law. If the prosecution had been successful, it would send a powerful message. Trying to overturn an election isn't just a political disagreement, it's a crime with serious consequences.
Yeah, it would have been a landmark case for sure. But, as we mentioned earlier, this whole thing never went to trial. Trump got reelected, and the DOJ, citing its policy about not indicting a sitting president, they just dropped the case. It raises some tough questions, though, about the balance of power and whether our system actually protects against a president abusing their power.
Yeah, it's a real what-if situation that legal scholars will be debating for years to come, I'm sure. Does dismissing this case set a dangerous precedent? Could it create a loophole where a president could do similar stuff and get away with it just by winning re-election? These are uncomfortable questions we need to grapple with as a society.
Big questions for sure. And the controversy didn't stop there. Even releasing the report itself became a whole thing, with some people saying it could unfairly hurt Trump, mess with the presidential transition, or even break special counsel rules.
Yeah. The report actually addresses those concerns directly, acknowledging the arguments against releasing it, but ultimately concluding that the public's right to know the facts outweighs those concerns. Transparency, in a case this big, was seen as super important. It's about making sure people have the information they need to make informed judgments and hold those in power accountable.
It's also important for the historical record, right?
Yeah.
So these events don't just get swept under the rug and forgotten.
Exactly. It ensures that these attempts to overturn the election aren't just a footnote in history, but a stark reminder of how fragile our democracy is and how we always need to be vigilant in protecting it.
Speaking of protecting our democracy, the report goes into some of the procedural stuff, the legal battles that Smith's team had to fight during the investigation. It wasn't just like a simple case of gathering evidence and filing charges. They had to overcome obstacles every step of the way.
Yeah, one of the biggest hurdles was executive privilege. Trump kept using that to try and keep certain communications secret, arguing they were confidential and protected under that whole separation of powers thing. It led to these long legal fights about which documents and conversations could be disclosed and how to navigate those claims while still investigating thoroughly. The report actually gives a pretty interesting look at the back and forth between the special counsel's office and Trump's lawyers, showing how complex executive privilege claims can be and how they can impact investigations into a president's actions.
Yeah, executive privilege, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
Oh, for sure.
And then there was that whole X, I guess, search warrant controversy. Remember that? Huge legal battles about getting access to Trump's social media data. It was a real clash between like the needs of the investigation and protecting people's privacy, especially for someone as high profile as Trump.
Right. Social media has become this gold mine of evidence for investigations, but it also brings up all these legal questions about warrants, privacy rights, and how to balance those competing interests.
Yeah.
The report goes into detail about those arguments, showing how Smith's team had to convince the courts that the evidence they were looking for on Trump's social media was more important than the privacy concerns. It's a really interesting example of how technology is changing the game for legal investigations and making us rethink how traditional legal principles apply in the digital age.
It's like the law is constantly playing catch up with technology.
Yeah, definitely.
Another tricky situation they had to deal with was former Vice President Pence invoking the speech or debate clause privilege. Now, full disclosure, I had to do some Googling to fully understand what that even meant. It's like this constitutional protection for members of Congress, right?
Right. It's supposed to make sure that lawmakers can freely debate and vote on laws without fear of getting in trouble or facing legal consequences. The problem for Smith's team was that Pence, as the president of the Senate, argued that his role in the electoral vote certification was protected under this privilege, so they couldn't ask him certain questions about his actions leading up to and during January 6th.
Ah, I see. So tied their hands a bit.
Yeah, exactly. The report doesn't go into all the legal specifics of Pence's claim, but it does say that it made it a lot harder for them to get the full picture of what happened behind closed doors in those crucial days before the Capitol attack.
Makes sense. And to top it all off, they had to deal with the very real threat of witness intimidation. You know, Trump wasn't exactly shy about using his platform to publicly go after those who cooperated with the investigation or criticized him.
Oh yeah, that was a constant worry throughout the investigation. The report details several times when witnesses said they were afraid of retaliation or harassment from Trump or his supporters. In some cases, they even had to take extra security measures to protect witnesses and their families.
Wow. That's scary.
It is. It raises some serious questions about whether the legal process can even work properly in a situation like that. If witnesses are afraid to come forward or tell the truth because they might face backlash, it undermines the whole foundation of our justice system.
It's almost like it discourages people from telling the truth. They might hesitate to cooperate with investigations or speak out against wrongdoing if they think they'll become targets.
Exactly. It's a dangerous trend, and the report seems to caution against it. It emphasizes the need for strong legal protections for witnesses and for a societal commitment to upholding fair and impartial justice, even when it involves powerful or controversial figures.
So basically, this investigation was anything but smooth sailing. They constantly had to adjust their strategies as new legal challenges popped up, all while under the microscope of public scrutiny and this incredibly polarized political climate.
Yeah, it was a high-wire act, for sure. And it says a lot about the dedication and perseverance of Smith's team that they were able to navigate all these complexities, gather the evidence they did, and present a comprehensive report, despite all the obstacles they faced.
It's impressive, for sure. So they managed to produce this incredibly detailed and thought-provoking report that continues to spark debate and discussion even years later.
Exactly. Even though the case against Trump was ultimately dismissed, the report is still a valuable historical document. It shines a light on a crucial moment in our nation's history, raising important questions about presidential power, accountability, and the strength of our democratic institutions.
And it reminds us that protecting our democracy is an ongoing effort that requires all of us to participate, not just those in positions of power.
Absolutely. The report kind of challenges each of us to think about our own role in upholding democratic values and safeguarding the institutions that protect those values.
It's a call to action, in a way.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into some of those specific examples from the report that really bring this whole thing to life. You know, I always find that it's the details, those little moments and interactions that make history feel real and help us connect with the human side of things. What are some of the moments that stood out to you as you were reading through it?
Well, there are so many, but let's start with that now infamous phone call between Trump and Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State. It's a perfect example of the pressure campaign that Trump and his allies were using to try and overturn the election results at the state level.
Oh, yeah, I remember when that audio first leaked, it was just wild. You could hear Trump, in his own words, trying to bully and pressure Raffensperger into finding enough votes to change the outcome in Georgia. It felt like something out of a movie.
Yeah, it was pretty unbelievable. And the report gives even more context to that call, explaining what led up to it and what happened afterward. It really paints a picture of a president who was willing to abuse his power and influence to try and manipulate a state official for his own benefit.
It was so blatant, so in your face, that it almost seemed funny at times. But then you realize how serious the consequences could have been if Raffensperger had given in to that pressure. It would have set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that election results were negotiable and that those in power could just strong-arm their way to getting what they wanted.
Absolutely. It would have undermined the entire integrity of the electoral process. And that brings us to another key moment highlighted in the report: the fraudulent elector scheme. This was a much more complex and coordinated effort to undermine the election, involving multiple states and a whole cast of characters who were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep Trump in power.
I have to admit, this whole scheme was a bit confusing to me at first. Could you break it down for our listeners who might not be familiar with all the ins and outs of the Electoral College?
Sure. Basically, Trump's allies in several states that Biden had won came up with this plan to create fake groups of electors who would cast their votes for Trump, even though the actual election results showed Biden as the winner. They hoped to create enough confusion and chaos during the congressional certification process that they could potentially throw the whole election into dispute and ultimately overturn the results.
So they were essentially trying to create this alternate reality where Trump actually won, even though the real vote said otherwise.
Exactly. They were trying to manufacture this parallel electoral process that would compete with the legitimate one, hoping to sow enough doubt and discord that they could swing things in Trump's favor.
It sounds almost too crazy to be true, like something out of a political thriller.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the report lays out the evidence, the emails, the meeting minutes, the testimony from those involved, painting a picture of a deliberate and coordinated effort to subvert the will of the voters and undermine the entire foundation of our electoral system.
And then, of course, you have the pressure campaign on Mike Pence, which was a whole other layer of this attempt to overturn the election. The report details numerous meetings, phone calls, and public statements where Trump and his allies tried to convince Pence that he had the unilateral authority to reject electoral votes and declare Trump the winner.
Right. It was this unprecedented ask, one that went against long-standing constitutional norms and the typical understanding of the vice president's role in the certification process.
Imagine being Pence in that situation. You're the vice president, you've been loyal to the president throughout his term, and now he's asking you to take this incredibly controversial action, one that could potentially throw the country into a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, the pressure must have been immense. And the report really captures the drama and tension of those final days leading up to the certification, as Pence grappled with his conscience, sought legal advice, and ultimately decided to uphold his constitutional duty, even if it meant facing Trump's anger and the anger of his supporters.
It's really a testament to Pence's character that he stood his ground, even when facing such intense pressure from within his own party and from the president himself.
It was a pivotal moment in our nation's history, one that could have easily gone in a very different direction had Pence chosen to give in to the pressure. It's a stark reminder that even when facing immense political pressure and personal risk, there are individuals who are willing to prioritize their constitutional obligations and the rule of law above all else.
And I think those are the stories, the moments of courage and principled action that we need to focus on as we reflect on the events of 2020 and the challenges to our democracy that continue to this day. It's easy to get caught up in the negativity and the partisan bickering, but it's important to remember that there are people on both sides of the aisle who are committed to defending our democratic values and ensuring that the will of the people prevails.
Absolutely. And I think the report, despite its focus on the darker aspects of our recent political history, ultimately offers a message of hope. It shows that even in the face of unprecedented challenges, our institutions held, our system of checks and balances worked, and the peaceful transfer of power, albeit a tumultuous one, ultimately prevailed.
So we've been talking about, the big picture of Jack Smith's report, the events of 2020, the whole thing. But I think it's time we get into some of the really interesting, maybe even disturbing details that came out of this whole investigation.
Yeah, sometimes it's those little things, those behind-the-scenes glimpses that really show you how serious this all was.
Absolutely. It's one thing to talk about the allegations, but it's the details, those specific moments and interactions that really bring the human drama, the potential danger, into focus.
One detail that really stood out to me was the thinking behind that fraudulent elector scheme. They weren't just trying to create chaos. They were trying to exploit a very specific weakness in the Electoral Count Act.
Okay, now that's interesting. Break that down for me because I'm sure most of our listeners aren't constitutional law experts.
Sure. So the Electoral Count Act is basically the rule book for how Congress counts the electoral votes and says who won the presidential election. But this act was written way back in the 1800s, and, well, it's a little vague on how to handle disagreements about which electors are actually legit. Trump's team seemed to be counting on that vagueness.
So they were hoping that if they could cause enough confusion, throw up enough legal challenges, they might be able to convince at least one member of Congress in both the House and the Senate to object to the slate of electors from those states where the results were disputed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if they could pull that off, it would throw the whole process into chaos. They can then argue that, since there was no clear agreement on which electors were valid, it would be up to Vice President Pence, as president of the Senate, to decide which slate to accept. Their plan, it seems, was to pressure Pence into accepting the fake electors, and that would give Trump the win.
Wow. It's like they were trying to game the system.
Oh my.
Find those loopholes and ambiguities in the law and use them to their advantage. It's kind of brilliant, but also terrifying.
Yeah, it really shows you how even our most established democratic processes can be manipulated if people are willing to ignore the spirit of the law and just exploit technicalities to get what they want.
It really underlines the importance of having clear and unambiguous laws and people with integrity who will uphold those laws even when it's difficult.
Couldn't agree more. Another thing that really struck me in the report was the intense pressure that was put on people like Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State. The report talks about how Trump personally called him over and over, urging him to find enough votes to change the election results in Georgia.
And it wasn't just a casual request, right? The report says Trump even hinted that Raffensperger could face criminal charges if he didn't do what he asked.
Right. Imagine being in that position. You're a state official. You're responsible for making sure the election is fair and honest, and you've got the President of the United States pressuring you to basically rig the results.
That must have been an incredibly difficult situation to be in. It must have taken a lot of courage for Raffensperger to stand up to that pressure and refuse to compromise his integrity and the integrity of the election.
It was a huge moment, not just for Raffensperger, but for our democracy. It showed that even when facing pressure from the most powerful person in the country, people can still choose to do the right thing, to uphold the law and protect the integrity of our elections.
And then there's the pressure campaign on Mike Pence, which we talked about earlier. The report really gets into the details of the legal arguments that Trump's team was using to try and convince Pence that he had the power to just, throw out the election results and declare Trump the winner.
It was like they were trying to rewrite the Constitution, to twist the words around, to fit their own agenda.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even our most important documents, like the Constitution, can be open to interpretation and manipulation, and it's up to people with integrity to defend the true meaning and intent of those documents.
Right. And the report, it doesn't really take sides in that legal debate, but it does present the arguments from both sides, which lets readers form their own opinions about whether those claims were valid or not.
And that's one of the things that makes the report so valuable, I think. It's that commitment to transparency and fairness. It's not just about trying to prosecute someone. It's about giving a full and accurate account of this important moment in our history. It makes you think about, the limits of presidential power, the importance of a free press, the role of the courts in upholding the law.
Definitely. And it also highlights how fragile our democracy is, and how we always need to be on guard to protect it. What happened in 2020, it's a stark reminder that democracy is not something we can just assume will always be there. We have to actively defend it and work to keep it strong.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do you want them to think about after they finish listening?
Well, I hope they come away with a better understanding of how complex this whole situation was, the legal issues, the constitutional questions, the human stories at the heart of it all.
Me too. And I hope they're also inspired by the courage and integrity that we've talked about, the people who stood up for what they believed in, even when it was really hard and risky for them to do so.
Yeah, that's important. And most importantly, I hope they'll want to keep talking about these issues, to really think about them, to seek out different perspectives, and get involved in shaping the future of our democracy.
Because the events of 2020, they were a wake-up call, for sure. They reminded us that protecting our democratic values is a fight that never ends, and it's a fight that we all have a role to play in.
Absolutely. We can't afford to be complacent. We have to stay engaged, stay informed, and be willing to stand up for what we believe in.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we hope you'll join us again next time for another fascinating exploration of, well, whatever catches our attention next. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
And don't forget to check out the full report for yourself if you want to dig deeper into this case. It's a really fascinating read.
Thanks again, everyone.